There is a critical distinction that separates households that survive extended emergencies from those that quietly deteriorate. And it has nothing to do with how many cans of food are sitting on the shelves. Most people who invest time and resources into emergency preparedness operate under a foundational assumption that sounds reasonable until it is tested under real conditions. If there is enough food, there is enough survival. This assumption collapses, reliably and predictably, somewhere between days 5 and 10 of a genuine disruption. The food is still present, the stockpile hasn't been exhausted, but the people depending on it are no longer functioning at the capacity they were on day 1. Strength has declined noticeably, decision-making has become sluggish and reactive. Digestion has grown uncomfortable enough that eating feels like a chore rather than relief. Tempers are shorter. Sleep is worse. And the psychological coherence that holds a household together under pressure is fraying at edges that weren't even visible at the start. None of these symptoms come from caloric deficiency alone. They come from a set of physiological and psychological gaps that standard emergency food planning was never designed to address. The typical preparedness checklist solves for hunger. What it cannot solve for is sustained human function, the full spectrum of physical, cognitive, and emotional capacity required to navigate a prolonged crisis without deteriorating from the inside. The 12 items outlined here exist to close those gaps. None of them are expensive. None require culinary expertise or specialized preparation equipment. None of them appear on conventional emergency checklists, and that absence is precisely what makes them valuable. They represent the territory between being supplied and being functional. Number 12. Potato flakes. The architecture of most emergency food stockpiles is built on the assumption of a body operating under normal physiological conditions. A body capable of processing fibrous grains, digesting dense legumes, and extracting nutrition from complex carbohydrates without difficulty. That assumption holds reasonably well in the early stages of a disruption. It begins to fail around week 2, and it fails in a specific, predictable way. A body subjected to sustained psychological stress, disrupted sleep patterns, irregular meal timing, and physical exertion is not a body operating in its optimal state. It is a body in managed decline, and the digestive system is among the first systems to reflect that decline. Gut motility changes. Stomach acid production becomes erratic. Foods that were nutritionally appropriate 2 weeks earlier become physiologically difficult to manage. Whole grains require sustained chewing effort and generate significant digestive demand. Dense legumes, the backbone of most long-term food storage plans, become sources of discomfort rather than sustenance when the gastrointestinal system is already under strain. The food that was supposed to carry a household through a crisis can begin working against it. Potato flakes were engineered for exactly this contingency, even if they were never marketed that way. No chewing required. A minimal digestive load. No electricity, no cooking equipment beyond the capacity to heat water. They integrate seamlessly into thin porridge, add nutritional density to watery broths, and maintain palatability, even when appetite has been compromised by stress and fatigue. Their strategic value is not nutritional sophistication, it is unconditional deliverability. At the precise moment when a body can no longer cooperate with the rest of a stockpile, potato flakes remain accessible. Store 2 to 3 canisters. Cost almost nothing. Their value will not become apparent on day 1. It will become apparent on the day when everything else has become an obstacle. Number 11. Full-fat canned coconut milk. By approximately the 4th or 5th day of subsisting on a rotation of rice, dried pasta, and legumes, a phenomenon occurs that very few emergency preparedness resources acknowledge. Eating stops feeling like relief and starts feeling like an obligation. This is not a psychological weakness. It is a physiological and sensory reality. The texture landscape of most emergency diets is strikingly narrow, dry, grainy, and structurally monotonous in a way that only becomes fully apparent through direct experience. When the act of eating shifts from satisfying to resistant, caloric consumption begins to drop. Portion sizes unconsciously shrink. Meals are left partially finished. The cumulative shortfall is silent and compounds rapidly. Full-fat canned coconut milk addresses this structural problem at its root. A quantity stirred into cooked rice, blended into porridge, or incorporated into mashed starches transforms the textural experience of a meal from fragmented and dry to cohesive, smooth, and genuinely satisfying. The psychological signal that results, the sense that a meal is worth finishing, has meaningful downstream consequences for sustained caloric intake. Beyond texture, the concentrated fat content serves a biochemical function that most people dramatically underestimate. The absorption of fat-soluble vitamins and minerals, vitamins A, D, E, and K, along with numerous phytonutrients, is directly dependent on the presence of dietary fat. Without adequate fat consumption, a substantial portion of the nutritional value embedded in the vegetables, proteins, and seasonings being consumed is simply not absorbed. It passes through unutilized. Coconut milk's fat content also stabilizes blood glucose by slowing the rate of carbohydrate digestion, extending the duration of satiety and moderating the energy spikes and crashes that characterize a high-carbohydrate emergency diet. Store the full-fat variety specifically. Reduced fat formulations provide neither the textural benefit nor the metabolic function that makes this item genuinely valuable. Number 10. Dried seaweed. Among all the oversights embedded in conventional emergency food planning, this may be the most consequential and the least visible until it is already causing measurable harm. There is a fundamental distinction between macronutrients, the calories, protein, and fat that provide energy and structural substrate, and micronutrients, the minerals and vitamins that regulate the biochemical processes those macronutrients depend upon. Standard emergency stockpiles are built almost entirely around macronutrients. The micronutrient side of the equation is largely ignored. The consequences of this gap do not announce themselves immediately. Iodine deficiency, for example, does not produce obvious symptoms in week 1, but the thyroid gland requires iodine to synthesize the hormones that regulate metabolic rate, body temperature, and energy utilization. As iodine stores deplete over 2 to 3 weeks on a staple-heavy diet with no supplemental mineral sources, the effects begin to surface as persistent fatigue, unexpected sensitivity to cold, cognitive sluggishness, and a general decline in functional capacity that is commonly attributed to stress rather than nutrition. Magnesium deficiency follows a similarly gradual trajectory, contributing to cardiac rhythm irregularities, compromised neuromuscular function, sleep disruption, and anxiety intensification that compounds the psychological burden of the crisis itself. Dried seaweed, nori, wakame, kombu, is among the most mineral-dense shelf-stable foods available. It delivers concentrated iodine, magnesium, calcium, and a broad spectrum of trace minerals in a format requiring no preparation, minimal storage space, and virtually no caloric displacement. A small portion incorporated into daily meals, stirred into rice, dissolved into broth, crumbled over porridge, provides mineral intake that no other conventional emergency food item can replicate. Reframe how you categorize it. Seaweed is not a food. It is physiological infrastructure. It doesn't fill you. It ensures that everything else you are consuming can actually perform its intended function. If this level of detail is genuinely useful to you, the kind of analysis that goes past surface-level preparedness into what's actually happening inside the body, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe. The remaining items are where this list becomes genuinely counterintuitive. Number 9. Instant noodles. The most underestimated threat in any extended emergency is not physical. It is motivational, and the mechanism by which it degrades a household's functional capacity is both predictable and largely preventable. Human psychological architecture was not designed to operate effectively under conditions of complete sensory monotony. When the same meal, identical in flavor, aroma, texture, and visual presentation, repeats day after day with no variation, A process of morale erosion begins that progresses far more rapidly than most people anticipate. Irritability escalates. Interpersonal friction sharpens into genuine conflict. Appetite suppression becomes more pronounced. People begin eating less not because the food is unavailable, but because the psychological resistance to another identical meal has grown stronger than the drive to consume. This deterioration is not trivial. Reduced caloric intake weakens physical capacity and impairs cognitive function. Interpersonal conflict within a household degrades the cooperative decision-making that crisis management depends upon. The stockpile begins depleting ahead of schedule because resources are being mismanaged by people who are no longer thinking clearly. A single serving of instant noodles, in a completely different flavor profile, with a different cooking aroma, a different texture, a different visual presentation, is sufficient to interrupt this cycle. The brain registers genuine novelty. The nervous system receives a small but real signal that a version of variety still exists. That signal has stabilizing effects on mood and interpersonal dynamics that far exceed what the nutritional content alone would suggest. From a practical standpoint, instant noodles also consistently remain available during supply disruptions well after staple goods have been panic purchased. They are not perceived as emergency food, and consequently, they are not targeted in the initial surge of stockpiling behavior. Store genuine variety. Multiple distinct flavor profiles and formats. The psychological benefit is a function of perceived difference, and that requires actual variation. Number 8. Textured vegetable protein, TVP. The macronutrient composition of virtually every standard emergency stockpile is dramatically skewed toward carbohydrates. Rice, pasta, flour, oats, and dried beans provide the bulk of caloric storage, and that structure is logical from a cost, shelf life, and volume perspective. But it creates a predictable physiological problem that begins manifesting within the second week of sustained inadequate protein intake. The human body maintains a continuous biochemical requirement for amino acids, the molecular building blocks that protein provides. When dietary protein is insufficient to meet this requirement, the body sources amino acids from the only available reserve: skeletal muscle tissue. This process, called catabolism, is not a distant worst-case outcome. It begins measurably within days of consistent protein deficiency, progresses at an accelerating rate, and becomes increasingly difficult to reverse once established. For individuals over the age of 40, the rate of muscle catabolism under protein deficiency is significantly more pronounced. Physical strength diminishes faster than expected. Recovery from routine physical activity, which is elevated in emergency conditions, becomes disproportionately slow. The functional consequences compound with each passing day. Textured vegetable protein provides a practical and highly efficient solution. Dehydrated and shelf-stable, it requires only hot water to rehydrate within 5 to 10 minutes, developing a texture that approximates ground meat closely enough to provide genuine satiety and psychological satisfaction alongside its nutritional function. Mixed into rice, stirred into broth, or incorporated into any grain-based preparation, particularly with added fat from ghee or coconut milk, it fills the protein gap that carbohydrate-dominant emergency diets leave open. Store it alongside your primary staples, not as an afterthought. Its role is not supplemental, it is structural. Number 7. Nutritional yeast. This is the item that generates the most skepticism when introduced to people unfamiliar with it, and that skepticism is entirely understandable given its unconventional presentation. It is also the item whose absence becomes most clearly identifiable in the cognitive performance of people operating on a restricted emergency diet. Between days 10 and 14 of subsisting primarily on grain and legume-based meals, a deterioration in mental sharpness tends to emerge that is commonly attributed to sleep disruption, stress, or the psychological weight of the situation itself. These factors are genuine contributors, but they are frequently not the primary cause. The primary cause is B vitamin depletion. The B vitamin complex, particularly B1, B2, B3, B6, B9, and B12, plays a foundational role in neurological function, energy metabolism, and cognitive clarity. Standard emergency staples carry virtually no meaningful B vitamin content. B12, specifically, it is absent from all plant-based foods and is among the most critical nutrients for sustained neurological health. Its deficiency progresses from subtle cognitive impairment to more serious neurological dysfunction over weeks of inadequate intake. Nutritional yeast is one of the few shelf-stable, non-animal sources of complete B vitamin nutrition, including B12 in fortified formulations, alongside a full amino acid profile that complements the incomplete proteins provided by grains and legumes. 2 to 3 tablespoons incorporated into any hot preparation adds a mild, savory depth to otherwise bland meals while delivering nutritional content that has no equivalent in conventional emergency food categories. Begin using it in the first week before cognitive symptoms develop. B vitamin depletion, once established, requires considerably longer to reverse than it does to prevent. Number 6. Ghee conventional approaches to dietary fat in emergency preparedness treat it as a secondary consideration, a comfort item rather than a functional necessity. This is a significant mischaracterization that carries measurable physiological consequences within the first week of its absence. Standard cooking fats fail rapidly under crisis conditions. Refined oils oxidize and develop rancidity within weeks at room temperature, particularly in warm environments. Conventional butter lacks shelf stability without refrigeration and degrades in flavor and safety within days of ambient storage above typical room temperatures. When these fats are exhausted, and they are typically exhausted faster than anticipated, the body's access to fat-derived energy is severely compromised. The physiological consequences of sustained dietary fat inadequacy are not immediately dramatic, but they are consistent and compounding. Energy availability drops in ways that carbohydrate consumption cannot compensate for. Cognitive performance declines. Physical endurance diminishes. Fat-soluble vitamin absorption, already discussed in the context of coconut milk, is further impaired. Ghee exists entirely outside these failure modes. The clarification process that removes milk solids and water eliminates the primary vectors of spoilage that compromise conventional butter. A sealed jar of ghee at room temperature retains full stability and usability for months to over a year without refrigeration, including in warm ambient conditions. Its smoke point exceeds that of most conventional oils, making it versatile for any preparation method available in crisis conditions. From a nutritional function standpoint, a tablespoon incorporated into plain rice or beans transforms the caloric density and satiety profile of the meal substantially, converting a preparation that provides basic energy into one that sustains genuine physical and cognitive performance over an extended window. Store it in glass. Use it consistently from day 1. 2,000 words in, and we are just reaching the items that most fundamentally redefine how to think about emergency preparedness. Like this, share it. Subscribe. The next entries are the ones that matter most. Number 5. Whole wheat berries. Every item discussed thus far operates within the framework of a conventional emergency food supply, items that supplement and enhance a core stockpile of processed, prepackaged staple goods. Whole wheat berries occupy a fundamentally different category. They represent the transition from food consumer to food producer. The structural vulnerability in virtually every standard emergency stockpile is one that most people never examine: total dependence on the continued availability of commercially processed goods. Flour, rolled oats, packaged grains, all of these were manufactured elsewhere, packaged by external infrastructure, and distributed through supply chains that may not be operational during the precise disruption being prepared for. When those manufactured goods are exhausted, the typical household has no capacity to produce replacement staples from primary ingredients. The supply ends, and with it, optionality. Whole wheat berries eliminate this vulnerability. In their unprocessed form, they are raw seeds, biochemically protected against degradation, resistant to spoilage, and stable in storage for years when maintained in sealed, moisture-controlled conditions. More importantly, they are genuinely versatile without requiring electricity or commercial equipment. Soaked overnight and slow-cooked, they produce a soft, digestible grain porridge. Dry roasted and roughly ground with basic hand tools, they yield a warm, textured cereal with a significantly different eating experience. Ground to a fine flour and combined with water and salt, they produce flatbread that can be cooked directly on any heat-capable surface. 3 substantively different food preparations from a single ingredient under primitive conditions. This versatility carries psychological weight that transcends nutrition. The capacity to make choices, to determine the form of what is prepared, restores an element of agency in an environment where most variables are fixed and narrowing. That agency has measurable stabilizing effects on morale and household cohesion. Keep wheat berries in reserve. Deploy them when primary supplies begin to deplete. Their presence in storage represents an option of last resort that very few households maintain. Number 4. Vinegar earns its position not through a single compelling function, but through an unusual concentration of entirely separate practical applications, any one of which would make it worth storing in quantity, and the combination of which makes it among the most versatile items a household can maintain. Preservation. Without refrigeration, cooked food deteriorates at a rate most people significantly underestimate, particularly in warm conditions. Bacterial proliferation in cooked starches and legumes can render a meal unsafe within hours at elevated ambient temperatures. A measured quantity of vinegar incorporated during preparation reduces the pH of the food, creating an environment meaningfully hostile to bacterial growth. The culinary impact is imperceptible at appropriate ratios. The food safety extension is real. Digestion. Emergency diets heavily concentrated in dense starches and complex legumes impose a sustained burden on digestive function, particularly in individuals over 40, whose gastric acid production is frequently already operating below optimal levels. Compromised stomach acid production results in incomplete breakdown of complex carbohydrates and proteins, increased fermentation in the lower digestive tract, and the bloating and discomfort that discourage further eating. A teaspoon of vinegar diluted in warm water consumed before a meal measurably improves gastric acid activity and digestive efficiency, enabling more complete nutrient extraction from available food. Sanitation. Commercial cleaning and disinfecting products are rarely included in emergency stockpiles in meaningful quantities, and they are typically among the earliest consumables to be exhausted. Vinegar's antimicrobial properties, while not equivalent to clinical-grade disinfectants, are sufficient to maintain adequate sanitation of food preparation surfaces, cutting equipment, and cooking vessels, reducing the bacterial contamination risk that compounds rapidly in post-disaster living conditions. Flavor extension. A modest amount of vinegar can transform the flavor profile of otherwise identical meals through light pickling of available vegetables, extending both their edible lifespan and their contribution to dietary variety. The cost is negligible. The shelf life is effectively unlimited. The strategic return is disproportionate on every dimension. Or number 3, chia seeds. There is a psychological phenomenon that materializes in the middle phase of every serious extended emergency, and it is almost never addressed in preparedness planning because it does not fit the conventional frame of physical survival. Somewhere between day 5 and day 10, even in households with adequate food supplies, anxiety about resource sufficiency begins to drive consumption behavior in ways that are counterproductive and difficult to consciously override. Portions increase beyond genuine physiological need. Eating frequency rises beyond what hunger actually dictates. The interval between meals shrinks as the time between them begins to feel psychologically threatening rather than simply inconvenient. The supply depletes ahead of schedule, not because it was insufficient, but because the psychological pressure of scarcity overrode the rational management of resources. This is not a discipline failure. It is a physiological one. The sensation of hunger and the anxiety response to uncertain supply activate overlapping neurological pathways that are extremely difficult to distinguish experientially. Willpower is not an effective countermeasure to a physiological feedback loop. Chia seeds interrupt this loop through a structural mechanism. When hydrated in liquid, they develop a gel matrix that substantially slows gastric emptying, the rate at which the stomach clears and transmits satiety reduction signals to the brain. A small quantity of hydrated chia seeds incorporated into any liquid or semi-liquid preparation extends the physiological satiety window by several hours beyond what the caloric content alone would produce. The subjective experience of hunger diminishes. The urgency driving overconsumption recedes. Rational resource management becomes cognitively accessible again. Additionally, chia seeds absorb and retain water at a ratio approximately 10 times their dry weight. In conditions of elevated ambient temperature or physical exertion, where fluid balance is under pressure, this property contributes measurably to hydration maintenance, a benefit that compounds the primary satiety function. One operational note: chia seeds must always be fully hydrated before consumption. Consumed dry, as they can absorb moisture from the esophageal lining and present a choking hazard. Mixed with any available liquid and allowed 15 minutes to fully gel before consuming, they are entirely safe and operationally simple. Begin incorporating them early, before the anxiety loop develops, when they are most effective. Number 2. Seasoning cubes. Around the third day of an unbroken rotation of plain rice, boiled legumes, and rehydrated staples, a form of psychological resistance emerges that has no nutritional analog and cannot be addressed through caloric adjustment. The food is present. The body recognizes hunger, but the prospect of another identical, flavorless, sensory-devoid meal generates active aversion, a resistance that compounds with each repetition. This aversion is not a trivial inconvenience. Left unaddressed, it escalates into genuine appetite suppression, involuntary reduction in caloric intake, and the downstream physical decline that follows. In a household setting, it simultaneously functions as a source of interpersonal friction. The shared misery of uniformly unpleasant meals accelerates conflict in ways that degrade the cooperative function the household depends on. A single seasoning cube dissolved into cooking liquid transforms the sensory experience of a meal at the most fundamental level. The aroma is different. The flavor is complex rather than absent. The brain receives input that registers unmistakably as a substantively different eating experience. That signal interrupts the monotony loop. It restores a degree of willingness to eat that caloric need alone cannot generate once aversion has established itself. The secondary function of seasoning cubes is electrolyte replenishment, a need that receives almost no attention in standard emergency planning despite its direct consequences for physical function. Under conditions of heat, stress, or elevated physical activity, sodium, potassium, and mineral losses through perspiration and increased metabolic activity outpace what plain water consumption can replace. The deficiency manifests as nocturnal muscle cramping, persistent fatigue that doesn't resolve with rest, and a generalized weakness that is frequently misattributed to inadequate caloric intake. A warm broth prepared from a single cube provides electrolyte replenishment in a format the body can absorb efficiently, more effectively than solid food in many cases, and far more effectively than plain water. Remove them from the original cardboard packaging and store in sealed glass jars with silica gel desiccant. They require no refrigeration. They occupy negligible space. Their cost is minimal, and their contribution to sustained household function, both physiological and psychological, is consistently among the most significant of any item in this list. We are at the final item. If this analysis has changed how you think about emergency preparedness, please like and subscribe, and share this with someone whose household readiness you care about. Number 1. Ginger. This is the entry that receives the most resistance from people who are hearing it for the first time. And that resistance is understandable. Ginger presents itself as a culinary flavoring. Its actual function in an extended emergency context is something categorically different. Somewhere between days 7 and 14 of sustained crisis conditions, following the accumulated physiological burden of disrupted sleep, psychological strain, irregular nutrition, and the absence of normal regulatory anchors, a distinctive cluster of symptoms begins to appear. Orthostatic dizziness upon standing, a persistent dull pressure behind the eyes that doesn't resolve with rest, persistent coldness in the hands and feet that doesn't respond to warmth, a general physical unsteadiness that makes even low-intensity activity feel disproportionately taxing. The reflexive response to these symptoms is to eat more. More calories are not what is needed. The body at this stage is not in caloric deficit, but it is in regulatory deficit, a state of progressive dysfunction in the circulatory, digestive, and autonomic systems that have been operating under sustained stress beyond their designed tolerance. Adding additional dense, starchy food to a digestive system that is already functioning below capacity can actively worsen the condition.